Hello and welcome to today's webinar entitled Spotting and Alleviating Employee Burnout. We are going to get started here shortly, but first a few housekeeping items. Please note that all lines are muted, but we do want this to be interactive. So if you have any questions, please type them into the questions section of the GoToWebinar control panel, and we will be sure to reserve time to answer those at the end of the webinar. For today's agenda, we are going to be discussing what burnout is, how to get ahead of burnout, and then go over employee burnout recovery. And so without further ado, I will hand it over to our presenter today, Laura Hamill, Chief People Officer and Chief Science Officer at Limeade.
Great, thanks so much, Cassandra. Well, I'm so excited to be here with you all today. There's so many different kind of levels at which I'm interested in this topic. So first off, I'm interested in this topic because it really is an intersection between employee engagement and well-being. And I think we'll talk more about that, but it's so fascinating. It's also a topic that we all know about on the surface. We've all talked about burnout, but it really feels like very few organizations really understand burnout and really don't do very much about it. And really so many people suffer from it. I'd say finally, the reason why I'm really excited about this, besides kind of the professional interest, is I'm interested about this on a personal level. It's really something that I've been through before in my life. About 14 years ago, I went through a time where I really think, in retrospect, I was burned out. So there are so many reasons why I love this topic. And I also really feel like there's so much more for us to understand about it, and a lot more work we in organizations need to do to really alleviate it. So let's dig in. So the first kind of idea that I'd like to talk about is this concept of being on fire. That's what's so important about this burnout topic, is that you have to be on fire before you can even burn out. So what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is you have to be all in. You have to be really engaged in your work. You have to be at this point where you're really giving your all to your work for burnout to even ever happen. So it's really important for us to realize that those are the people who we want to keep in our organizations, those people who are so committed and care so deeply about their work. But again, sadly, those are the ones, by definition, that end up burning out. So how do we actually spot burnout? So there are some really important phases that happen when somebody is burning out. So the first one is this idea of exhaustion. It starts with exhaustion. And so this is the kind of exhaustion that, a good night's sleep does not cure. It's the depletion kind of exhaustion, just so tired. So it starts out with that. And that's probably what we would many times think of when we think about burnout, is just being completely exhausted. But the second stage is the one that I think is a really important one. When we become so exhausted, one way to kind of separate ourselves from that exhaustion and that stress is to become cynical. So you get to the point you think, I'm so fed up, I just don't care anymore, what's the point? And it really is, when you think about people who might be kind of considered toxic or really hard to be around. Now, again, I just want to reiterate this point. That is a natural stage of burnout, to become cynical. It's a way for you to detach emotionally from your work. And then finally, the third stage is this concept of inefficacy, the idea that I'm just not making a difference. I try, and what's the point? Why do I keep doing this? So those three stages are very natural. Now, not everybody goes through them in the same amount of time, or maybe not always in the same order, but they very much depict somebody who's going through burnout. So if you can think about yourself or think about somebody you know who might be at risk for burnout, and if they're starting to exhibit these kinds of signs, that's how you can spot it. All right, a really important concept is, how is burnout different from being disengaged? So again, burnout is this idea, I care so deeply, I've cared for so long, I really haven't had a break from the stress, that you really become depleted and cynical. It's just this idea of, I've given everything to this job. But disengagement's different. It's different because Disengagement means I don't care. Either I'm past the point of caring or I've never cared at all. So people who are disengaged, think about it, this is just a job. I just come to this job, I just do what I have to do, and then I go home. I really don't care. So the concept of caring about your work, caring deeply about your work, is not present when somebody's disengaged. So again, remember, you have to really be on fire in order to burn out. Disengagement are people who are not on fire. And the trick here is you actually, over time, after you've burned out, maybe one way to cope is you can become disengaged. But it's very important to know that there's a difference between being burned out and being disengaged. Now, optimally, what we all want to feel is we want to be energized by our job. We want to be connected to our jobs. We want to feel a sense of purpose through our job. So what we're striving for is for people to feel more engagement. So when you're engaged, you think about it like this is way more than just a job. So that's really the difference between those three concepts, and they're pretty important ones. So most companies tend to think of burnout as a real personal issue. It really is an organizational one. And so what do I mean by that? I'm going to share with you in just a minute the drivers of burnout. But I think one of the reasons why I mentioned in the beginning that burnout is something that we all know about, but very few organizations do anything about. I think it's because we think of it as a personal issue. So think about what I was telling you before around those signs of burnout. So that second one about becoming cynical, I think that is one of the reasons why we tend to think of it as a personal issue. People who are burned out by nature, by definition, can become very toxic to be around, hard to be around, difficult to be around. So I think that's one of the reasons why we think it's personal. I also think it feels personal because when people go through burnout, a lot of times they have other things that are happening at the same time. So sometimes it's substance abuse. Sometimes it's going through a divorce. Other times it could be, gaining a lot of weight. There are almost always things that are happening, ways that people are trying to alleviate their stress that happens when they're burning out. So that really also makes it feel highly personal as well. I think another reason why organizations haven't done a ton around burnout, besides those really important reasons, is that it tends to be a topic that doesn't fit really nicely in a silo, in an HR silo. So burnout sort of crosses the silos of benefits and more like talent management or the group that might be responsible for employee engagement. So it really is a topic that goes across silos and requires us in human resources to work together to really understand. So I think all those reasons together have made us feel like burnout is a real personal problem. But really, the research, and this is great research by Christine Masloch, the research is really clear that burnout comes from organizational drivers or problems. So primary causes of burnout are things like overload, that we have our crazy levels of expectations in terms of the amount of work that we expect people to perform, and then time pressure on top of that. There tends to be role conflict and ambiguity as one of the big drivers, that we're not clear about who owns things or how we work together to make things happen. There's also other things here around, how managers are supporting us in terms of just general support, feedback, whether or not we feel like we get to participate in decision making. So there's a lot here about fairness and equity and trust, how we really feel like there's trust in the organization, that we're trusted, and that we trust the company we're working for. So interestingly, those are the things that drive a sense of burnout. They're not about individual people and their own inability to handle stress. It's really these organizational issues. So why do we care about burnout? There's, if it's not obvious, if any of you listening, you're not thinking about your own kind of personal kind of struggles with this, there is lots of kind of support to say that it affects people greatly. So when you're burning out or on the path to burnout, you have lower productivity. You tend to have those stress-related health issues, right? It can be related to anxiety, depression. There's also a whole more likelihood of having substance abuse problems, so increased substance abuse. You can think about alcoholism for sure in that mix. So there's lots of things that happen to somebody who's going through burnout. It's so hard, and it really has a big impact on people's lives. But organizationally, it also has impact. So people who burn out tend to leave the organization. Either we ask them to leave or they quit. And if they don't leave, they tend to become disengaged. So they're really not as committed, they're not as performing as well. So people who burn out will leave the organization in one way or another. So one of the things that is kind of interesting is it's not yes or no, burned out or not burned out. There actually are phases of burnout. And those phases of burnout really can have to do with how much stress you're feeling and how engaged you are. So there's this concept that really talks about balancing all of the demands that come to you with your own resources that you have to deal with those demands. So that's called the demand resource model. And that really is how you can think about, how do you either maybe reduce the demands that you have or increase your resources. And so that's really where we start thinking about the topic of well-being. Well-being is a primary strategy or method for us to really think about having more resources to deal with the stress and the demands that are happening in our lives. So you can see here the different phases of burnout. So you could start out being disengaged, as we talked about before. So that is not even burnout, right? That doesn't, remember we talked before about you have to be on fire in order to burn out. You have to be engaged to even get to the point of being burned out. So when you're disengaged, obviously we'd want to work on increasing engagement. But once you are engaged, there's low, moderate, and high risk of becoming burned out. And that's really where we would want to prevent burnout. But then if you actually are already burned out, that's a whole other set of things that you might want to consider. So it's really good for us to think about. It's not just, am I burned out or not burned out? It's where am I on this continuum? Am I at kind of low risk, or am I starting to show signs that burnout might be in my future? All right, so now what do you do about that? How do you get ahead of this concept called burnout? I mentioned earlier that one of the reasons why I care so much about this topic is I really kind of in retrospect realized that I burned out about 14 years ago when I was working in a large high-tech company, and I had this job that on paper looked amazing. It was the best job ever on paper, but in practice it was far from that. I had gotten to the point, I'd been there for about 10 years, I'd gotten to the point where I didn't even want to go to work every day. I sort of dreaded driving into work. So I wasn't loving my job. I felt like there was a lot of kind of things happening in the organization where I didn't feel like I was really making a difference anymore. I also at the same time found out that I had 2 autoimmune diseases that were very much stress related. My kids were little at the time, so I had 2 small kids, and that was so hard. It put so much more kind of that stress on me. Remember those demands, that concept of demands and resources. It was a big level of big demand, and of course a demand that I loved, but it was still really hard. On top of that, I really couldn't have told you the last time I had any fun. I wasn't doing anything with my girlfriends. I wasn't just doing anything that was kind of building me up or filling me up. So I got to the point where I just decided to leave that organization. And it was crazy because before I thought I was never going to leave there. I had, again, this great job on paper. So as I look back on that and think about it, I didn't really have a great language to talk about this concept of being burned out. And that's crazy because I'm an organizational psychologist. You'd think I could figure that out and know how to think about it. But I didn't have the language. I didn't really know a lot about kind of what I was going through. So I sort of felt alone in it. And for sure, I wasn't getting support from my manager or anybody in the organization who could see that I was going through some hard times. I had been, before that, kind of delineated as high potential, and but I was very, happy actually to leave that organization. So I feel like this is a topic that the more we can have a language around it, the more we can think about how natural this is, that there are phases to it, and that there are things you can do that it would, I think, feel a lot more positive. So I very much went through this in my organization, or in the organization that I was in at the time. So one little point on that high potential, that's a sign if you think about people in your organization who a year ago were on your high potential list and somehow a year later were okay that they quit or somehow we're letting them go. That's a sign of burnout, right? People who, again, were all in, were on fire, but now they're leaving the organization. I think that's a really important thing for organizations to pay attention to. All right, I wanted to share a little bit of some research that we did. Limeade Institute is one of the groups that I'm responsible for, and we do some, I feel like, pretty interesting research on this topic. So this is a study we did a couple years ago now, and we were looking at the statistical relationship between employee engagement and stress. So the way we were measuring engagement here is the response to an item of, I feel personally engaged in my work. So based on the responses, you can see we have really pretty large N sizes. We put respondents into 3 groups: high, medium, and low engagement. Then what we were interested in is how did they self-report stress? What was so interesting to me is that those people who had the highest levels of engagement reported the lowest levels of stress. So you can see here the 57% with low levels of stress within that high engagement group. What's interesting, like, think about the people you know who are really engaged at work. Those are the people who, have a lot going on. They're going from meeting to meeting. They make big lists. They always have stuff going on at work. You might think that those people are stressed, right? Just by the way you can see them and the way you see them, in your organization. What's interesting is that those people actually tend to report lower levels of stress. So what is going on with those people? So could those people who are engaged maybe be reframing stress? So maybe they don't think about their work as stressful. So they come to work, even though it looks like they have so much going on, lots of things to do, lots of responsibilities, maybe they frame that not in a way that's negative. Maybe they tend to frame that in a way that's more positive. So they might have an attitude of more, I get to do this thing, I get to have these challenges at work, versus I have to go to work or I have to have these challenges. Maybe even with the word challenge, they think about something as, ooh, I'm excited about tackling that, versus, oh my gosh, look at all the obstacles I have. Look at all the things that are hard about my job. So maybe those people who are engaged don't think about things necessarily as stressful, or they reframe it and talk to themselves a little bit differently about things that other people might think of as really stressful. It also could be that those people who are engaged feel more supported by their organizations. So maybe they feel like, I have a manager who cares about me. I have leaders who, know what I'm doing and are excited about the contributions I'm making. Maybe that's why they don't feel as stressed about this. So to me, it's really interesting to dig into this relationship between engagement and stress. So we looked also at the flip side. So remember, before we were looking at high engagement, low stress. What about the people on the other end of the spectrum? What about those people who have high levels of engagement, but they report also high levels of stress? So we're thinking that those people might be ones who don't have the well-being in their life to have those resources to be able to actually handle that stress. So we have been studying that special group of high stress, high engagement to really understand what's going on. So switching gears just a little bit, Now, what do we do? So if we know what burnout is, and we know a little bit more about how it's related to engagement, what do we actually do to try to prevent burnout? So individual employees, there are a lot of things that they can do to prevent burnout. So a lot of it here has to do with well-being. So first is just the concept of recovery, and we're going to talk more about recovery in just a few minutes. But it's a really important concept for us to know about. It's really this idea of making the space and time to relax, to think differently, to just kind of make the space after you've had some big event. Now, what's really important though is sometimes recovery time alone is not enough. Sometimes you have to do something different during that recovery. It's not just sitting there in a room for 30 minutes and then recovering. Sometimes you have to do some different things to actually feel replenished. But also sometimes recovery, there are other things you need to do on top of recovery. So for example, this idea of energy, finding projects that you can work on, people that you can work with that make you feel like you have more energy versus depleting your energy. There's also this concept of having a well-being mindset. So remember before we were talking about those people who are engaged, maybe they reframe things and think just a little bit differently than the rest of us. Also this idea of resilience and positivity and having self-efficacy, or this idea that you really believe in yourself. So there's a lot of work I think we can all do to have more of a well-being mindset. There's also the concept of purpose, how we can understand, and if we're not understanding our own purpose, do the work to try to reconnect to what our purpose is, connect with other human beings, and really work in organizations where you feel that sense of support. So there's a lot that individuals can do, but I always like to say, there's so much more to this than just what we individual employees can do. I think we should start there, but man, I think that organizations have such a responsibility to do more around burnout prevention specifically, and just general well-being support. So what might managers do? So managers really need to think about how they're supporting the well-being of their employees. So how could they encourage recovery time? If you know that one of your employees is going through something really big, doing a big presentation, or has a big deadline or big deliverable, how could you encourage that person to have a little recovery time afterwards? What about just meaningful check-ins with your employees? When you talk with your employees, when you have one-on-ones, are they meaningful, or are they just status reports? Do you have really good conversations about how that employee's doing? What are the things that are stressful, how they're feeling kind of excited about their work, and how maybe you could support them. And then really thinking about this concept of employee engagement. So you as a manager, how are you putting into place the conditions where your employees can feel engaged? So I'll share with you what those are in just 1 minute, but just to reiterate how important it is that managers really think about employee engagement. So just a couple statistics here from Gallup. Employees who rate their managers as excellent are 5 times more engaged than those who rate their managers as poor. So there seems to be something going on here around quality of manager. And the other one I think is so interesting. So managers account for up to 70% of the variance in employee engagement. So if you have a manager that isn't doing a good job, it's hard for you as an employee to be engaged. So managers in a lot of ways can really constrain or constrict the ability of a team or individual employees on that team to be engaged. So managers matter so much to this topic of employee engagement. Just a minute ago, I was talking about this idea of conditions for engagement. So what I mean by that is, we want to have more of our employees feeling excited, feeling a deep connection and sense of purpose about their work. Well, how do you do that? What are those conditions in order for people to feel that sense of engagement? So this is another study we did in Limeade Institute, and this was basically looking at what are those drivers that really create those conditions. So what needs to happen at work? So I'm not going to read all over all of them, but just a couple I'll highlight. People that feel that they're challenged, that they have a sense of purpose, that they're included, that they have kind of the right amount of stress. Because if you don't have any stress, it can be kind of boring. But if you have too much stress, obviously, we would worry about somebody burning out. Do we feel respected? Do we feel like this organization really cares about me as a person? So when we did our research, we found that these items, these topics accounted for 78% of the variance in people feeling personally engaged in their work. So it's so important for managers to really have a sense of responsibility for creating these conditions for engagement. All right, so I had said before we were going to talk a little bit more about the topic of recovery. So I've been interested in just the last year or so to really understand a little bit more about this topic of recovery. There actually are people who study this and who there's a kind of a whole science behind it. In fact, there's a woman on my team, Dana Outen, who's doing her dissertation on the topic of recovery. So there's, I think organizations are just sort of being recently introduced to this concept and how important it is. So I mentioned before that there are these different phases of burnout. So there's the low risk all the way to being burned out. You can imagine that the recovery that you might need could vary a lot from each of these different risk categories. So what you might need when you're at low risk could be very different from what you need when you're already burned out. So it's important for us to think about recovery in this more kind of nuanced way, that the recovery that somebody needs would vary depending on where they are along this continuum. So we've talked about what burnout is, but what is this idea of recovery? So it's processes, activities that individuals use or go through that you can think of as a way to really replenish their resources. So I would never want anybody to think about resources as something that's like, we're not talking about human resources or that function. Resources are really objects, personal characteristics, conditions, or energies that are acquired and conserved that allow us to respond to stress. They also help us build what we call a resource reserve. So if you have a lot of stress, do you have this reserve of lots of different things you could call on to actually be able to handle the stress? Or is your reserve really shallow? What we hope when people focus on well-being is that they build a really deep reserve, that there's lots of different kinds of resources that they can call on. Remember that, again, that concept of how many demands you have coming at you versus the resources that you have to respond to those demands. And recovery is really how we make sure that we always have this really great reserve of resources. So some examples of some resources. You could think about mindfulness and the work that happens when you're mindful, how that can build your resources. Resilience, optimism, deep breathing. That's a kind of a physical resource. Chatting with a friend, taking a class or a course is something that you're really interested in. Going for a walk, being in nature, cleaning your closet for some people, not me, but for some people. You know, there are a lot of different things you can do that really help you replenish your resources, recover. So there's also a lot of things that can happen at work that can help, that can be thought of as resources. So let's talk a little bit about these types of recovery that can be used to replenish our resources. So there are three primary types of recovery. So the first one is detachment. It's just mentally letting go of work during non-work time. So there are lots of different strategies for detachment. Yeah, I have an hour-long commute, and I tend to use NPR to detach from my work, but it has a lot to do with mentally letting go of work. Now, relaxation is another type of recovery, but it's just a slightly different kind of take. It's really low effort, relaxing activity. It can for sure include physical and social things. It tends to be, but not always, a little bit more physical, while detachment is a little more mental or emotional, kind of what happens in your head. Relaxation tends to be a little bit more about what happens in your body and as a way of recovery. Mastery, I think, is a really interesting one. It's another form of recovery. It's the idea of having challenging activities and learning opportunities outside of work. So things that kind of get your head wrapped around something different from work as a way to recover. So you could think about people who, do Toastmasters, or maybe woodworking, or a club that they're in, or rock climbing maybe is a really challenging thing. Somebody on our team does community theater. She's amazing. To me, that would feel really hard and stressful, but for her, she's mastering community theater, and it's a way for her to really recover. So within this, it's important to think about this concept called high duty versus low duty. So within these types of recovery, do you really feel like you have to concentrate hard, be really all in when you're recovering? And so high duty and low duty is a really important idea when it comes to some of the things that we think might be recovery, but they actually don't end up being recovery. So let me throw in an example. For any of you who are parents, you might, somebody might say, oh, you get to go home after work and play with your 2-year-old. Well, yes, but I don't know if we can count that as recovery. And what I mean by that is that watching your two-year-old play, and of course it's rewarding and so much fun, but it's a high-duty activity. So that high-duty activities don't allow us to really replenish our resources. So we have to be able to not feel kind of a total sense of responsibility when we're recovering. So that's why there's some interesting work around, how women, especially women who are working full-time and have responsibilities outside of work for children or parents, tend to be more likely to burn out because they have so many demands. And when you would think that we would be able to have time for recovery in our evenings, we actually don't. We have a high-duty sense of responsibility that makes our demands much higher than our resources. So these types of recovery are interesting. There's been some pretty cool research on them. And what we've seen is that these actually are related to important outcomes that an organization might care about. So when we recover, all three of these have been studied, and they've been shown to have relationships with higher performance at work, being more proactive at work, also relatedly having more personal initiative, and having more vigor at work, kind of that energy at work. Probably no surprise, right? But hopefully when I read those to you, that sure does sound like employee engagement, right? So you can see how these topics of well-being and burnout and recovery and employee engagement, they're all really related to each other. They all kind of come together. All right. So a couple little footnotes to this is individuals vary a lot. So it's probably obvious, but sometimes work is not the center of everybody's life. How important work is can vary a lot. How much people think about work outside of work. My husband and I are always surprised because we both have backgrounds in organizational psychology, and a lot of times we'll go to a party or a get-together, and the first thing we want to talk about is work. And it's kind of no surprise, I guess, that not everybody wants to do that, right? Work is not the center of everybody's lives. And so if that's true, then maybe how they think about this and how much of a risk they have for burnout, that could vary a lot. There's also a lot of different ways that people could think about recovery. So they have different recovery needs, and for sure, different recovery preferences. I was teasing before about that mastery idea. Maybe there's some kinds of mastery that I wouldn't ever want to do that, in terms of helping me recover. But there are others that I absolutely want to do. So going out and, taking a walk in the woods is much more something that I feel like I prefer than, learning how to play chess, maybe. So there's a lot of different preferences. So we absolutely have to vary how we approach this, this topic person by person. Recovery can be really difficult. And in some ways, there are a lot of forces that are working against us when we think about this topic of recovery. One of them is this idea called the autonomy paradox. So it's this feeling of we are moving into a place where we tend to give employees more freedom, more autonomy to make their own decisions and to own things in many organizations, which is wonderful, right? But the paradox with that is sometimes that puts a lot of stress on people, a lot of a sense of responsibility, and feeling like they own things can really be hard. And so that can make recovery really difficult when you're like, I own this thing and I want to see it be successful and I want to make this happen. It really can make it hard for us to focus on burnout and recovery. Obviously, having cell phones that, were constantly sending us messages, not clear, when you're working, when you're not, having so much responsibility, right? All these demands coming at us. And then couple that with this idea of we don't really know this topic of recovery very well in organizations. We don't really have words to talk about the different kinds of recovery. We haven't gotten that into our vocabularies yet. And honestly, how many of us have given ourselves permission to even recover? I always talk about this idea. I tend to do quite a few webinars and talks and things like that. And now I try to actually schedule time after each one of them to have recovery time, because what I was doing before is I'd go straight from a talk into a different meeting on a different topic, and I'd pretty much be no good to anybody, pretty distracted and pretty tired. And so I'm trying to work on giving myself permission to just recover, to take a break, not to try to do a email or the list of things that I had on my list before the presentation, but really do something that just lets me breathe a little bit. So do we give ourselves permission? But then, of course, I will throw on top of that, do we have cultures and climates in the organizations we work in where we support this topic of recovery? Do we really, again, think about what people are going through in their day-to-day work and how recovery could actually help them not only feel better, but be able to perform back at the levels that we want them to perform at? It really is pretty crazy, the expectations we have on how productive we are throughout the course of a whole day. It's unrealistic in a lot of ways. So we really need organizations to start understanding that recovery is just natural, right? That we have to have a natural kind of ebb and flow of working real hard and having some time, some downtime, in order to be able to come back up and have higher levels of productivity. So what should organizations do? It's kind of what I was just talking about, is how could we start to really introduce the concept of recovery and have our organizations truly support it? We could talk about it more. We could educate people. We also could think about, remember the idea of the demands and stressors versus the resources? So you could think of both of those as levers. How could we reduce the demands and stressors that we give our employees and also build up those resources? So it's both of those things I think that we need to do. So one practical thing we really try to do here at Limeade is we truly think, and we are working on this and we think it's true, but we think that employees really feel like it's okay to leave at the end of the day at a reasonable time if they have other things to do, if they want to go to a workout or a yoga class, if they want to go to their kids' baseball game, that it really is something that's supported. It's not just saying it on the surface that we support it and then kind of look funny at people as they walk out the door, that really it is something that is supported and that doesn't have any negative consequences. So recovery is something organizations can do so much more with. What about managers? So managers can again, think about this idea of recovery in the day-to-day. So what if there were recovery moments for our employees? And also, what if we think about, recovery can vary a lot from person to person. And so what one person's recovery doesn't look like another person's recovery. So even just getting to the subtleties as a manager of knowing your employees and maybe what they might need. I think being a role model is a really important piece here. Making sure that when we're really having times that are hard, that we actually do something for that, for our own recovery. We take some steps and we show people that it really is okay. And it's not only just okay, it's how I'm going to come back and be back to the way I was before this big event. The last one I'd just say is how we as managers own our kind of sets of responsibilities around removing work obstacles. And I know that's hard, and I know there are so many obstacles, but do our employees feel like we are actively trying to help those go away or help them tackle those obstacles? One of the things we do here at Limeade is we very much want our managers to have those check-ins to talk about the well-being of each of their employees. So not just, again, status checks, what's going on with this project or that project. Instead, how are you doing? How are you feeling? How can I help you? To have it be a more meaningful check-in and really getting to, to talk honestly about what's happening for that employee would help so much. All right, finally, individuals. What can individuals do to recover more? So just even knowing about this concept, I think, is a good place to start. How we can, move away from working all night long, right? Working on vacations, how we can really have more discipline around that. Seeking help. If you're feeling burned out or you're not feeling like you can recover, talk to your manager, talk to somebody about it. Talk to somebody in the human resources team. And really remember that recovery is necessary for quality work performance. We have such high expectations for ourselves. I find myself really expecting this brain of mine to work at high levels throughout the whole day. And it's unrealistic and impossible to think that we would be on 24/7. It's really hard to do. So we have to give ourselves breaks in order to come back to that high level of functioning. Some things we do here as kind of a norm for employees at Limeade is people take walking meetings, meaning just getting outside, getting that perspective, getting some fresh air, moving your body can do wonders to just help feel a little bit more recovered. Also mentioned before about just blocking out those those recovery times. Go into your calendar and try to do that, or figure out some way that you can have active recovery. So just want to end on one last kind of fundamental idea, and it's this concept we call organizational support. It's really this thing that's about, do our employees feel reinforced, encouraged, nudged to have well-being in their lives? Do they feel like taking care of your well-being is just easy here? It's what we do. It's part of our culture. And so instead of thinking about well-being as a program or something that we just kind of hope people take advantage of, it's something that's consistent and authentic and real. And anywhere an employee turns, if they're talking with their manager, if they're talking to people in other kind of social networks like employee resource groups, if they're listening to leaders, that the message is loud and clear that we care about you as a human being. And not just because that's good, it's a good thing to do, but it's good for our business when we do that. We perform better. So that is something that I think all of us, every organization, can continue to work on. You're never done. It's something that you always have to keep thinking about is, how is this organization supporting its employees? How are we showing them that we care about them and that they're core to the success of our organization? All right, so some key takeaways from the talk today. First, burnout is high when you have these sustained levels of engagement, and that starts intersecting with low well-being. So either you as an employee don't have well-being or haven't figured out ways to get more of that well-being, maybe through recovery, or the organization really hasn't intervened in any way to support your well-being. Second, most companies think of burnout really as a personal issue, remember, because people can be toxic. There's also tends to be a lot of other issues going on around substance abuse and relationship issues, but it really is an organizational one. The drivers of burnout are organizational in nature. Focus on supporting well-being and employee engagement. If you want to reduce burnout, you got to think about both of those things. Many organizations have well-being in one HR silo and employee engagement in another, and we really have to come together and start thinking about these topics from the perspective of the employee, not the perspective of our HR departments. And finally, recovery is so important. So really starting to understand the importance of recovery and just this topic and how we can start weaving it in more and more.
We do have some questions here. One would be, what are some of the early signs of burnout?
Yeah, I think that probably goes back to one of those first stages where that exhaustion. I think the very first stage would be when you see people who are just looking depleted. I can kind of see it when I look at somebody. I can see their energy or kind of lack of energy where they look like they've kind of been run over. So that first sign is really about exhaustion. I think the next sign is that idea of starting to become cynical. So when you see people who are asking or talking about the leaders of the organization in a negative way, or their customers, where before they used to be so customer focused and happy to serve customers, now they're saying negative things about the customers that they're working with. So people who are kind of part of their ecosystem that they used to be fine with, now becoming more negative about.
Okay. Another question here. If you can sense that someone is burning out or already burned out, how can you approach that conversation?
Yeah. So I think it might depend a little bit on, your relationship with that person, how well you know them, what your role is. So if you're a manager of that person, what I might say is, I notice that you are looking like you're really tired, you're exhausted, you seem really stressed. Can you tell me, Liz, is that true? Are you feeling that way? Tell me about it. Tell me what's going on with you. Just ask open-ended questions to try to understand from their perspective what's happening. Don't make assumptions about the intention behind that, or about what they're going through. Ask, talk to them like a human being. I think that's really the first place I'd start. And then once you find that out, think about, again, depending on your role, what are some things you could do to help? But I would also push them to other resources. Almost every organization has an employee assistance program. And I find that most companies don't really use their employee assistance program. There's so many amazing resources that are available. There are counselors, there's financial well-being counseling. There's all kinds of different ways that we can support our employees through those employee assistance programs. But a lot of times it's hard to find, how to contact them. It's hard to find, that resource. So that's probably the first place I would point. And then see if they want to talk to their human resources representative, their person who can also maybe help them think about ways they can build up some of their resources.
Absolutely. Another question here. What if a manager is perhaps not the source of burnout, but is also not a support system? So I guess they're moving a little bit towards how can you kind of become a little bit more of a support system as well?
Yeah, so that's interesting, right? Because what might be underneath that is that, of course, there are organizational stressors, right? There are things that are happening in the business, maybe leaders that are causing stress. I think if managers can try to help remove some of those obstacles, that's one way, or help kind of address some of those things that are more systematic or systemic. So if there's a particular problem that's been facing that employee or the team, how does the manager try to do something to rectify that, to try to tackle that? So I think that's one way. I think for managers to really, try to be an advocate for their employees. What is that manager doing, again, to either ask for some ways to build up the resources or reduce those stressors? So I'd love to see that manager be more proactive in really creating some change in that organization.
Absolutely. And how can my organization measure burnout?
Yeah, so burnout measurement is an important one. And again, very few organizations do that. We've been doing that now through our product, but we're getting even better. We're going to have more of those different stages of burnout that we're going to measure through our product over time. So that will be interesting. But I think if you don't have a current way of measuring it and you're not one of our customers yet, I would think about on your employee engagement survey. Most of us have on employee engagement surveys drivers of engagement. Remember those kind of conditions for engagement? We also tend to have things that are more kind of the outcomes of engagement, maybe recommending my company is a great place to work, or even a question that says something like, I feel engaged in my work. Sort of an overarching question. What I would love to see is add a question about stress or add a question about well-being. So overall, I have well-being in my life. What if that was in your employee engagement survey? Or overall, the stress in my life is manageable, and you can see the degree to which people agree or disagree to that. You could combine well-being or stress with your levels of engagement. And that's a way you can do like a crosstab of those two items. And you can start to see people who might be at risk for burnout. So again, I'd look for those high engagement, high stress people and think that those might be the people who are at risk for burning out.
Absolutely. And then we have a few more questions here. How does one distinguish between burnout and depression?
Well, I would say that you can definitely, because of burnout, because of the things that are happening at work, depression, clinical depression, absolutely could come with that. So I'd say that, I would say those are sort of topics that both need to be addressed. I would think about burnout as, the way, what happens at work and how that's causing that. But I'd say somebody who has depression should absolutely seek medical help for that, because it's obviously so serious. So they can go hand in hand. I think, again, that's what makes this topic of burnout so hard. It almost always goes hand in hand with something else that's very serious that is, life or death. And so that's why we as organizations need to understand that it can start with the things that we are doing to our employees. And we really need to own up to that and take more responsibility for it.
Absolutely. And do you have any advice for individuals who try to talk about burnout with their managers and HR, but the organization just shrugs it off? So how do you get leadership to care?
Yeah, getting leadership to care is hard. Sometimes it takes, leaders themselves to go through it. But I think that I'm seeing more and more in in journal articles, in kind of popular press articles. Maybe there's a way of showing that data and research that is in existing articles to your leaders, but I really would encourage you to think about how to measure it. I think measuring it and looking at this combination of stress, well-being, and engagement in your organization is it's an eye-opening way for our organizations to understand how big of a deal it can be. I think until we measure it, it's hard to really make an impact in our organization. So sometimes it's an individual person's story. Sometimes it's seeing what the research is out there externally. But I think the most impact we could have is by starting to measure it internally.
And how do you differentiate between burnout and disengagement?
Yeah. So disengagement really truly is, I don't care, right? I don't care about my job. I don't care what I'm going through, and so it's just people coming to work and just doing the bare minimum. So you can kind of tell when people don't want to have part in conversations. They don't follow through on things. They're just thinking about their job as a job. it's so different from burnout, because burnout is when that person has cared so deeply, right, that they really have burned out. So if that person, if you know that person cared at one point, cared deeply at one point, but now they've just separated themselves just to handle the burnout, and that's why they're disengaged, that's a whole other thing. But if the person's never cared about their work, that's just pure disengagement. So it's a really different set of things to do. So if somebody's disengaged, we got to work on those conditions for engagement and get them to be more engaged.
Absolutely. And so that's all the questions that I'm seeing in the GoToWebinar control panel right now. But thank you, Laura, for joining us today for this webinar. It was great. And thank you to all of the attendees. We will be sending out a copy of the presentation and the recording. So thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, everybody.